Well, how brave you all are. I'm sure you've noticed what time it is. So I have one thing to say to you. Listen to your mother. Now, Westerners are really fond of a particular saying that very much sticks in my craw, and the saying is, life isn't fair. And after they have apprised you of the fact that life isn't fair, some of the more snide will announce triumphantly, so get used to it. Life isn't fair, get used to it. Well, here's something. If you say to an Iroquois clan mother, life isn't fair, you know what she's going to say? Then make it fair! In fact, I distinctly recall when I was a little kid. I was about 8 or 9 years old, and TV at that time consisted of replaying movies that had been out in the 40s and early 50s. And so if you turned on the TV in the afternoon and say, well, Mom was making dinner, there was going to be some old movie on the channel. And I remember in particular one old movie, it was a courtroom scene. And a defendant in the courtroom was protesting against the law under which he was about to be sentenced, or at least convicted. And he jumped up and he yelled, but it's not fair, it's not fair. And the prosecutor, very unctuously and self-importantly, walked up, I think he had a big Bible, and he slapped it down in front of the defendant and said, show me in there where it says life is fair. And at that point, the jury started twittering, and this was supposed to be comic relief in this very grim movie. Well, it's not actually quite comic relief, and in fact, as the scene was progressing, I could hear my mother in the kitchen banging pots and pans around, and all of a sudden she shouted, she had a pan in each hand, and she shouted, then make it fair, you sadist! In my house, we did a lot of shouting at TV. You know, TV is a big purveyor of Western values. And it was like a running fight with the television. I'm surprised nobody put their foot through the dang thing. Now, this is a piece of advice worth listening to, isn't it? Then make it fair. Make it fair. This is a piece of mother right advice. This is the sort of thing that a mother is going to tell you. The contrast between Western patriarchal and Iroquois matriarchal culture couldn't be more obvious than in this particular little exchange. There's a lot of things trailing around the edges of this example, but mainly, I think that it displays the perceptions of Western culture about how much power little people have. You know, we're all the little people. Under patriarchy, the answer is none. Under matriarchy, there are no little people, there are just people, and the answer to how much power people have is total. You have total power. Now, I've spent a long time, a lot of my life, trying to think about where this distinction comes from between the patriarchal and the matriarchal approaches to things. And I believe that it comes from Western culture's God ideation. The Iroquoian make it right comes from the matriarchal God ideation, and there's no actual God ideation involved. It just comes from Iroquoian spirituality. Now, I know that academics are not supposed to talk about spirituality, and I can get drummed out of the academic corps for even mentioning the word. In fact, I'm supposed to run from it screaming like, you know, like it's carrying hemorrhagic smallpox or something. But I think if we're going to examine the real impetus of mother right, we're not going to get anywhere until we walk right up and we look at the spiritual underpinnings of the system. By the same token, I don't think we're going to be really able to free ourselves of the really damaging effects of patriarchy until and unless we recognize the spiritual allegiances that undermine community, constantly undermine community in patriarchy. Now, the Iroquois are totally unapologetic about having spirituality as a part of just about everything we do, and I think that Aggie certainly brought that home. So if we want to understand anything that's economic, that's social, that's political, we need to look at the spiritual underpinnings of it. And this is another thing that I heard from my female elders. If you want to understand a thing, look at its spiritual structure, look at its spiritual roots. And if you see those roots, then you will understand what that thing is. Now, every council of any honor begins, just as this one did, with somebody delivering the Thanksgiving address, the words before all else. And I think it's important, if you understand it on a mature level, what you understand is that there's an energy out, Thanksgiving, the energy out, to allow the energy that comes back in to replace the energy that just went out. That's what you're actually doing, recycling energy here. And you cannot acquire the one good mind of consensus unless you are doing the energy out to allow the energy in. And that was the container that you were talking about, Jen, I think. And in fact, if a council fails, you know what? Traditional people are going to look around at the faith keeper that opened it there with that Thanksgiving and wonder if maybe there was something wrong with the original presentation. There wasn't. It was beautiful, Aggie. But people will wonder what was going on with the faith keeper, that he or she did not present this correctly to allow the consensus to begin to build. Now, Aggie certainly explained it, but in the Thanksgiving, basically what you're doing is you're starting from Mother Earth and then you're working your way up to the stars. So you're going from the Earth on up. And you're actually standing there and you're recognizing every single entity, every single one. And one by one, you're recognizing the special wisdom, the special gift that each one brings in and thanking them for it. That's actually what you're doing in that address. And one of the things that tells us is that the one good mind of consensus actually requires the active participation of everybody in the community. It can't be done without active participation by all. So everybody matters. Everybody counts. And I remember my mother specifically saying, don't leave anyone out. Don't leave anyone out. And if anything was ever counted up and somebody was left out, you started counting again from the very beginning. Why? Because somebody was left out. And that's not acceptable, because exclusivism destroys community. It's the first and best way to destroy community. Inclusivism, on the other hand, is very important to creating community. It hears absolutely every comment. It hears everything that's going on, and it hears it in the voices that raise the issue. That's pretty important. I think one of the most damaging misunderstandings of good-mindedness is something that actually Heidi was just talking about, is the assumption that because everyone is equal, everyone possesses equal amounts of wisdom and talent. And therefore, everybody should share equal amounts of power. Okay, well, this is a prescription for disaster if I ever heard one. Because people simply do not have the same type or amount of talent or wisdom. Everybody has a different thing. That's why, in the words before all else, we acknowledge the special thing that each one is bringing. If everybody was bringing the same thing, there'd be no need for those words. It's basically patriarchal monotheism that thinks that everybody looks alike. You know, seen one, seen them all. That's a patriarchal idea. Instead, everybody has a limited amount of wisdom and a limited amount of talent, and the idea is to make it all work together for the good of everybody. No one person's going to be able to do this alone. Each spirit has a limited amount of knowledge, and that goes for human beings, that goes for any of the spirits. For example, if you want to know about corn, what do? Well, you go ask Sister Corn. That's what you do. She sure knows a lot about being corn. She knows more than you and I do. She knows more about being corn than Sister Squatch does. But guess what? If you ask her about Brother Tobacco, she might know a little bit about him, but she doesn't really know about Brother Tobacco. If you want to know about him, you better go ask him. Okay? And one of the important points spiritually about this is that there is nothing that's all-knowing. There's no all-knowing spirit anywhere. Everything is a collective attempt. We all dump it into the center and then see what we got after we're done collecting up all of what we have. I think that it's important to understand that the sort of spirituality that patriarchy works from comes from a desert locale. Okay? It's a desert spirit. It's a desert god. And it's a male desert god. And he may know some things, but everything he knows comes from a desert, right? And if you transplant that spirit out of his proper place, which is a desert place, and dump him, say, on the Great Lakes, he's going to have absolutely no idea of what's going on in the Great Lakes, because there are spirits of place, and those spirits of place know what belongs in that place. You cannot transplant spirits from one place to another. They do not understand, nor will they recognize, or be able to know what to do with ceremonies that were created in another place. It's quite improper to perform ceremonies from one place in another place where the spirits here don't understand what's going on. The result's going to be the spirits will try to respond, but they're going to make mistakes because there isn't any omniscience. It just does not exist. So there's no omniscience in any matriarchal system. Matriarchal system knows that people have frailties, that people have failings, and that's understood and recognized without any prejudice. It's just something you're going to work around. So no one council arrogates the right to dictate to anybody else. It just is not going to happen. It better not happen. There's no overriding entity, you know, say for instance that very annoying monotheistic God who sees all, knows all, controls all. Mother Right knows that basically claiming more wisdom than you have is actually a crime. It's actually a crime against the people. And all that's going to happen is it's going to create havoc in its wake. Now, my great-grandmother, Worry, who raised me when I was little, told me that the Christian God, that desert God, he has to be an imposter. There's no other possibility. He's an imposter. And she likened him to the younger twin, male twin, Flint, who was always trying to take more credit than he really earned. Okay, he wasn't, he had his own talents and his own wisdom. His talents were the kind of thing where you could make a waterfall, which is a very nice thing to do. But he didn't have talents, for example, in people making. His brother Sapling was a pretty good people maker. So Flint decided he wanted to be a people maker too. So he tried to create human beings out of salt water. Okay? And he actually got the form of the human being right, but when he tried to stand it up, it just kind of went splat down on the floor because there was nothing to hold it up. Now, instead of admit that that wasn't his talent, he grabbed a few bones out of his own body, didn't even bother to wash them first, and stuck the water around him. Okay, now this thing can kind of slosh around a bit and maybe impersonate a person, but he wasn't a very good human being. Okay? Why? Well, Flint just didn't have the talent to do this right. He just didn't have that talent, but he didn't necessarily recognize that he didn't have the talent. Well, clan mothers recognize that people only have so much talent, so one of the main things is you don't overburden any person. You spread out the responsibility, you spread out the obligations so that no one person is overworked. So basically, especially with elders and youngers, they have totally different talents. Youngers are real good at running around and having energy at 10 o'clock at night. Elders, not so much, right? So basically, if there's some running around to do or some traveling around to do, you send the youngers out. You know, the women will go out and they'll farm, and the young men will go out, they'll hunt, and they do all this running around. Meantime, what are the elders doing? You're a little more arthritic. You're just kind of sitting there by your teapot, you know, making sure there's some nice tea around, making some corn soup, making sure it's there if anybody stops by and is a little bit hungry. But see, the youngers are working with their limbs, but the elders are working with with their sky spirit, their breath spirit up there in their heads, and with their blood spirit right here in their hearts. And they're following them out and seeing the point at which they meet, which is the point where you're establishing policy for the community then. So they're doing that kind of work, which is more appropriate to their talents and their wisdom than trying to run about as though they were 20 years old. Now, this didn't mean that elders did not hear the youngers. You know, you had the Young Men's Council, it's always mistranslated in Western Texas, the Warriors Council, and then you have the Young Women and Children's Council. And you hear those words, and their grandmothers, and actually it's great uncle, not grandfather, it's great uncles' councils, and those uncles were brothers of the mothers. And the amount of wisdom that was gained from all of them was gathered together and distilled through the grandmothers, who had, as Heidi was just saying, the ultimate responsibility for the welfare of the people. So that government accorded grandmothers, for example, with the obligation of putting officials in office. That was one of the things you do. Why? Because you had that distilled wisdom and you'd heard from all the different constituencies of what was supposed to be going on, and now you can put in place the right person to do the job. This was seen as a sacred responsibility, but it was done by consultation, not by fiat. By contrast, of course, you know, you've got all power and wisdom collected in that one annoying sky god up there. And by example, he basically anoints men to rule the roost, which is God, desert God behavior, once more. Now, it's interesting, therefore, to see how the grandmothers, the traditional grandmothers, described this desert God. He was described physically. We always describe things physically. He was described as a naked, hairy, cross-legged, known as cross-legged man, sitting right in the middle of the ground. This says a lot of things. The hairy part, for example, you know the proper place for hair to come from? The top of your head. So you got hair coming from all other places in your body. Your thoughts are really screwed up. That's one of those little traditional things. The fact that he is seated on the ground indicates that he's actually an earth spirit. He's not a sky spirit at all. He's an earth spirit. And so he's claiming wisdom and power that he doesn't actually have. So basically the monotheistic God there, that see-all, know-all God, is a con artist. He favors oppression by elites that are kind of in cahoots with him. So one of the worst aspects of the hierarchical monotheistic con game that's going on is something that Rabbi Michael Lerner has identified as surplus powerlessness. Surplus powerlessness, that's an extremely clumsy phrase for a very important insight. What's going on is that the God con convinces people that they have no power, convinces people that all power resides with that God and people themselves have no power. So basically, it's amusing to watch Christian prayers. They're always basically versions of, oh, please, God, don't squash me today. Communication with God has to get funneled through the one person he's least likely to squash, you know, his son, that father-son relationship. So basically, you've got a bunch of people hiding behind Jesus, peeking out here and there, and hoping maybe Jesus will intercede for them at some point with this wild, unaccountable, crazy God that they've got. Now, what's happening here is the total isolation of individuals. Look at it, you're isolated as an individual. You are forced to perceive reality through somebody else. Now, isn't that the standard definition of abuse? Seems to me that it is. This is no less true in spirit than it is in person, that this is a form of abuse. Westerners have been convinced to live in this paranoid isolation with their spirituality, and basically they're all hiding out from this psychopathic God who's flinging temper tantrums right and left, and they're cringing behind his son, hoping to be safe from this latest lethal attack. So let's listen to the grandmothers instead. Grandmothers presented creation as a communal project. Everybody had a little part in this. And by the way, some parts of it looked like nothing quite so much as an accident. You know, when you get matriarchies, accident is a very large precipitating factor of creation. So something happens and then you make it do, is one of the things that's going on. So you have the story of Sky Woman and her daughter and the animals, and all of them together are actually creating everything that's around us. The animals created the first bit of dry land. Sky Woman is creating more land as she's walking around. The daughter is growing a lot of the plants. The boys are putting up forests and mountains. So you've got creation spread out as a community endeavor. And it's no one entity is doing the creating. It's only coming together because everybody is doing a little bit. I think I've got to skip ahead a little bit here. Now, I've never really been close to high government officials, like presidents or senators. I've never had the dismal honor, I suppose, of being near them. But I have been up close and personal with some CEOs and presidents of universities and people like that. And I've noticed an interesting phenomenon. Once they get to the top, they look around and they suddenly notice there's nobody else there. There's nobody else there. And there are no 10 commandments carved in stone anywhere. And suddenly it dawns on them that there's no rules except the rules that they are making because there's nothing else there. This discovery has an unsettling effect on some of them, especially the more God-driven among them, and they keep trying to prove that something really is there, and somehow or another they magically know what it is and what he wants. So they start thinking that they actually have to come out with one life-changing decision after another, and of course it's not their own life they're changing, it's the life of all the employees and all the peons, right? They're changing their lives. I've seen some of them become almost unhinged by this. A few become cynical, maybe, a few quit. But they are totally dislocated spiritually by the discovery that institutions are just human-made. They're just people-made. People made them, and people can unmake them, people can remake them, people can retool them anytime they like. If things are unfair, all of a sudden they start realizing, as you said, there's somebody's rich over here because somebody's poor over there. If things are unfair, it's because the unfairness benefits somebody powerful. And powerful people just don't want to change the unfairness. There's nothing God-given or God-driven about that unfairness. It's a totally created situation. But by contrast, matriarchies start out knowing that everything is human-made, and therefore it can be humanly unmade or remade or redesigned at any point. This, of course, spreads out responsibility among everybody because you aren't powerless. Same time, it deflates a lot of distended egos. That's not too bad. So community, not the self, becomes the focus of people's endeavor. Everybody has and knows that they have social and economic and governmental responsibility, and they pick up that responsibility. Interestingly enough,